Dawn broke on a gallows that leaned like a busted windmill, a rope gnawing the neck of a boy whose boots barely scraped the frost-rimed plank, and a man in a sweat-dark duster standing among townsfolk who would not look at him because the last time a trigger had needed pulling, he had stared at his own hands instead of raising them. Before we begin this journey, subscribe, because the desert remembers every promise and every sin. The noose creaked as if the timber itself had a conscience. Beyond the square, cattle drifted like smoke across the mesa, their hides filmed with the white dust of a drawn-out drought, their shadows long and gaunt. A single child's shoe lay in flood silt under the gallows steps, left there from a spring flash that had torn a mule and 2 wagons out of the ford and nearly taken the boy with them. And the man in the duster had been there too, frozen as the water took what it wanted, reading the river like a ledger he could not change. That was how the territory marked cowardice, not with a word, but with a shoe no one claimed and a story told in the saloon until it hardened into a fact. By noon of that same day, a handbill flapped on a ranch gate a long ride from the square, pinned with a horseshoe nail whose head shone like a coin. Hiring, ranch cook, meals for one, room provided. Must be moral, competent, able to stay on property. It was posted because quiet had grown too heavy in the house, because bread burned when no one watched the iron stove, because a man who had buried a wife and 2 small names in his heart could not eat grief and ride fence forever. Dust hissed along the wire as if answering. The notice took the light in a way that made the letters look cut from shade. The man who posted it was 35 and tanned to saddle leather, a rider who knew where the line camp sat by instinct, and who still looked toward the canyon where a crossfire had erased a voice that used to sing while mending. He had a flaw old as the territory and sharper than a spur. Pride that stiffened into silence when mercy asked for speech, a stubbornness that had cost a life he loved and a life he could have saved. Pride kept him upright. Pride kept him alone. The road to his gate threw up a shimmer under the sun. At 1 o'clock exactly, a lone figure with 3 smaller shadows reached the post and stopped as if the land itself had told them to breathe before choosing. The woman's dress held the color of a winter creek bed and showed the care of someone who'd mended with thread earned a cup at a time. The bonnet strings had been retied often enough to remember old knots. One child clung to her shoulder, thumb pressed to a mouth that had forgotten milk. Another hauled a suitcase with a strap polished smooth by hope. A third dragged a grain sack that looked as if it had been snatched from a fire and saved for reasons the world did not respect. The rancher came down the steps with the careful gait of a man who had learned to make noise only when it mattered. He took in their faces, and he took in the way the woman stood, not bowed by distance, but braced by it, eyes the color of plains stormlight. The house had been a mausoleum since the crossfire. It took her one breath to make it a place where air moved again. The cattle ranch and its line camps were set out like the hours of a map. House at the center, bunkhouse shouldered into a mesquite thicket, north pasture slung beneath a bluff that threw shade as false as the smile of a man who knows your debt, south pasture a scraped plate that could blister a boot through the sole by mid-afternoon. A spring in the draw, fenced because water meant life and killing. A narrow road to the border town and its river ford, where the crossing took wagons sideways if you entered wrong, and a trading post with ledgers that could make poverty look like laziness and sin like arithmetic. Telegraph poles marched west with ceramic cups catching light. Sometimes at night the key at the water stop chattered like a rattler tail, warning of stagecoaches off schedule or raids that weren't raids at all. The rancher measured his days with cap and ball reloads, with the creak of leather when a saddle settled, with the metallic breath of a lantern when the wick caught and steadied, and with the feeling of the telegraph through the table when trouble tensed the wire miles away. He gave the widow 3 days, which in the territory meant a real chance and not a courtesy, and in those days hunger retreated, like a coyote edging back from a stronger shadow. Bread rose into an aroma that stuck to rafters. Beans simmered with a ribbon of pork fat that had slept unnoticed in the larder since winter. Coffee lost its bitterness like a grudge that had finally met a face. The oldest child moved through the kitchen like a broom handle made flesh, sweeping with care because clean floor was the one thing a person could win outright. The middle one was small and wiry and obeyed his mother with the kind of quiet that made grown men straighten. The youngest rode a wooden spoon like a stick horse until sleep unhorsed him, and he accepted the fall like a cowboy who knew the ground by name. None of them wasted the rancher's time with talk. Their presence rubbed his silence into something that could shine. When he rode into the border town for flour and lamp oil, voices gathered like flies. A saloon awning threw shade across men who worked at not working until a mark appeared. One leaned there with a matchstick making his mouth look entertained by its own cruelty. The foreman of a cattle association ranch that had too many riders and not enough land chewed the match like a man who wanted to bite anything that didn't bite back. A preacher's wife stood under the mercantile porch with a ledger peeking from her bag. His sermons about sin weighted more by entries than by grace. The rancher wore scorn like a duster. He had been the man who failed to lift his rifle when the river peeled a child from his mother's hands, and stories like that wore a groove through time. He purchased, turned, and endured the feeling of eyes on the brand at his horse's flank. His own mark and honest letter burned with his neighbor watching, as the law demanded when water and cattle tied men together or tore them apart. The first turn came when the sorrel mare broke loose at dawn, ripping free and bolting toward the open plain where dry thunder wandered. The rancher followed, rifle hanging as if it thought itself useless. He found sign near the canyon ridge. He found sign of something else, too. Boot tracks where no one had business, and when the shot came, he took it in the side because men who planned that kind of welcome did not waste powder. He made it home with blood making a tacky stripe down his ribs, jaw set not for show, but because it was that or fall. The widow turned the kitchen into a room where pain could not shout. Whiskey burned, thread bit, and the rancher set his teeth and offered steadiness so she could borrow it. By nightfall, he felt the pull of stitches, not as pride's lesson, but as proof that someone else's hands could hold a life together when his own had let one slip. Lantern light caught the sheen of sweat along his breastbone. Her kid boots scuffed the plank near the doorway in a rhythm that said fear had visited and sat down and then finally left. The second turn came with sky changing its mind in the time between fence post and fence post. A blue northern rolled a wall across the mesa, thunder splitting evening right when the rancher had told himself he could put his arm down for the night. Wind hammered the barn doors into their frames. He ran anyway, because stock and structure were more than property. A small figure crouched behind a half-collapsed trough, soaked and shivering, eyes big in the lightning glare. Wood broke, weight dropped. He did what he had not done at the ford. He threw himself forward and took the blow across his shoulder and did not let go until the boy's breath steadied against his ribs. The beam bit. The barn groaned. He found strength where fear had once lived and shoved until the world grudgingly shifted. Rain hammered his hat brim flat. Mud took his boots to the ankle, cold squeezing his bones until they felt carved instead of grown. He came out with the boy in his arms and a shoulder turned to fire by his own choice, and the widow reached them in bare feet, hair dark with water, and the touch of her hand on his cheek promised something he had never taken head-on, belonging that was not bought or earned, only offered and carried carefully as a lantern across wind.
News traveled with a speed that did not need telegraph, but the key did click anyway that week at the water stop. A frantic chatter that made boots thunder on the porch while the rancher stood inside with a tin cup trembling on a plank table, listening to the staccato message about fences down in the south tract and cattle crossing like a tide. Those hoofbeats were not his riders coming for orders. They belonged to men from the association outfit who believed the mesa gave more to the bold than the patient. The foreman dismounted with a smile that had cut other men, and behind him rode a deputy with a star that looked purchased, and a preacher with a ledger tucked under his coat as if piety needed proof in ink. The widow met the eyes of the deputy and did not lower her own. The rancher stepped to the gate and watched smoke rise from a far-night brand on a calf whose mother bawled inside his fence. Moonlight made the iron glow. A cattle brand smoked on stolen hide, and the night air took the smell the way a witness takes an oath. The third term came as lies always come, with an arrival that carried old filings of truth in its pockets. A rider shouldered through the yard with a posture that quoted an earlier life and a hat brim thrown back to show a jaw used to winning. He claimed the widow in a way that made the gathered women of the town purse their lips and men find something to kick gently with their boot toe. The rumor spread faster than an oil lamp mocked by a drunk. In places like this, the line between mercy and malice was no thicker than the paper of a deed. The widow went to market and returned with shoulders squared under eyes that had learned another lesson about endurance. The rancher went to the pastor and asked for what few men asked, records instead of consolation. He knew the tax roll better than his own pulse. He had his own reason for fearing ink. He had once signed away water rights he did not understand under the pressure of a drought and a loan, and that signature had come back as a ghost every time the river dropped rocks white as bones into the sweet light. He found his way toward truth the way a rider finds a crossing after cloudburst mud wrecks all marks, not by trust, but by patience. Lantern light flared over a ledger page in the church office, and he set his thumb in blood where a man ought to sign when the pen would only lie. The pastor flinched, but handed him the book. Right there, numbers and names made a story the town had snickered about turn to ash. The widow's husband was a different Hartley, by first name and by fate, buried under a wrong marker because the militia clerk had swapped pages after a raid that was not a raid at all, but a property seizure dressed up to resemble war. The rider on the porch was kin, but not husband, an opportunist who knew how to pull a thread from a town's hunger for scandal. The rancher walked with the ledger into the saloon where the foreman kept his orbit, and he nailed a copy of the relevant page to the church door the next morning so that Son would read it for them all. The door splintered around the nail, and the nail-head looked exactly like the one holding the cook notice to his gate. Public reckoning arrived with the appetite of a trail herd. Folks gathered on the square, laborers in apron and canvas, black troopers from the small fort east of town leaning in the shadow of their remounts, Chinese trackmen on a layover from the grading camp with hands like rope and eyes that missed nothing, women holding babies and baskets both, a midwife with an expression that had seen men flinch and had saved more lives than the sheriff. The boy spared at the gallows stood off to one side, neck a livid memory beneath a scarf that looked too hot for the day. Voices weighed survival against justice in their chests. The deputy tapped his star and said that the law was the law without saying anything a person could argue. The rancher did not speak over anyone. He listened to the widow inhale and exhale, steadying herself as if she were about to knead a stubborn dough into obedience. When they looked to him, he stepped forward with the ledger held like a baby. He opened to the page and let lantern light from the courthouse doors splash it. There was his blood thumbprint at the bottom where it had no reason to be and every reason. "Numbers do not lie," a man said in a voice that made it sound as if he wished they did. The rancher lifted his other hand and turned the book to the congregation of anger and hunger and hope. The truth was simple enough for children to parse and hard enough for grown men to protest. The page said the widow's name with the dignity the town had denied her. It also said another thing in careful script the foreman had not anticipated anyone would investigate. A quitclaim of water access signed in duress during the year of the Blue Northern and filed by a deputy who now wore a star because it had covered his own theft like a brand covers wild hide. Revelation changed the light over everything. The foreman's cruelty had been a shadow thrown by a larger shape. The association held notes on half the square. The preacher kept ledgers that moved debt like cattle, fattening it on men who could not read as fast as they could bleed. The underdog, who had come with a grain sack and 3 children who knew how to be quiet without being cowed, held the proof that money changed hands in the back room of the trading post the night before the flood, proof that the deputy had ordered the bridge crew to stand down so that wagons would stack up and owners would be late to the tax collector and ripe for a loan from the association. She had survived the saloon fire that burned through the dresses and the piano, and the memory of a clarinet wail that made men weep into tin cups. In the ash, she had found a half-charred page from the preacher's ledger, his initials clear as a brand, matching the book now in the rancher's hands. Her secret was not a rumor. It was paper, weighty as a bullet, thin as a lie. The rancher felt his flaw like another man might feel thirst. Pride had kept him from kneeling at a riverbank to reach for a stranger's child the year the shoe washed up. Pride had kept him from walking into the saloon to beg anyone who could shoot straighter to step up during the crossfire that took his wife, making him believe that running inside to pull her back out would have been less honorable than standing in the door and pretending to be a wall. Redemption does not come when a man asks for it. It comes when the cost rises to meet him. In front of the town, he told the truth that he had not been forced to tell, and that would cost him land. He explained that his signature on the water quitclaim had given the association the power to starve his neighbors and water their herds, and that he had put his name down because the drought had bent him and the deputy had leaned on him until he cracked. He tore his deed in half in front of them all. Not the one to his home, which would have been simple theater, but the deed to the north pasture where the spring ran true, and he handed the halves to the midwife to keep in the church chest until a new survey could be made with eyes that did not move under the foreman's shadow. He offered the spring to the town for as long as drought held, then for a year longer, on the record, to be signed not with blood this time, but with the signatures of 10 good hands. He paid another price at sundown. He rode to the association line camp with his right arm still weak from the barn beam, and he found 3 calves bearing his brand on the wrong side of a wire that had not been cut, but lifted and reset to hide tracks, and he drove them back alone, knowing that every hoofprint would be read as a challenge. Men watched from the bluff. He kept his back straight and his left hand on the pommel, because drawing down would have been vanity and a waste. Moon rose. Smoke from the branding fire had not yet thinned. A calf bawled, mother answering across the fence like a note pulled from a horn. The rancher did not sleep that night, but did not think himself brave for staying awake. He knew he was merely a man refusing to turn away again. In the morning, he found the saddle his wife had used, and he carved names into the leather where his hand would polish them daily. 3 children who did not carry his blood, and a woman whose presence turned a house from a past into a present.
When the foreman came next, he did not talk. He brought riders with the kind of posture that says the paymaster had hinted at a raise. The deputy rode in uniform, but smelled like fear under the cologne he had taken to wearing on Sundays. The preacher stood at the fence post with an expression composed in a mirror. The town materialized like a mirage that refused to vanish, people taking up positions on porches and under awnings with the stillness of those who know that heat and violence both travel faster when chased. The rancher walked to the gate with the ledger under his arm and his hat brim tipped to shadow his eyes. He laid the book on the gate post and opened it to the blood thumbprint page. Lantern light would have made it a painting. Sun made it a fact. The foreman laughed with his mouth closed. The deputy lifted his star like a shield. The preacher pressed his hands together and stared at the sky as if hoping for a wind to turn pages. The power shifted as it always does when a story finally tells itself. The buffalo soldiers edged their mounts forward just enough to make the association riders understand that not every black man in a uniform took orders from a star sold with a handshake. Chinese trackmen found shade and shared tea that smelled of iron and patience, and in that simple sharing announced that community was larger than any brand book. A freedman blacksmith dusted his apron with his knuckles and nodded once at the rancher. And the mayor, who had perfected the art of slipping out of crowds before the moment of decision, made the mistake of clearing his throat within range of the midwife's glare. The midwife said with her gaze that no one was being born today, and therefore she had time to see justice delivered. The association's real power sat far away in a ledger at a bank with columns that turned men into numbers. The foreman was only a spur. He understood it as soon as he saw the church copy nail-splitting the door and the town arrayed with more spine than he expected from people who worked so much they had no energy left for theatrics. He tipped his hat and stagecoached his face into a grin that asked everyone to doubt their own eyes. The deputy announced that a hearing would be held because paperwork demanded it. The telegraph key at the water stop stuttered again, and the boy with the scarf around his neck ran up with a note like a prayer scratched in dots and dashes. The message named a place on the river where black willow grew thick and where the county surveyor had marked a corner 2 years back, and it said that the mark had been moved during a flood and moved again during a night with no moon. The missurveyed line meant that the spring did not belong to the association at all. It had always belonged to the commons in the old Spanish record the pastor kept in a chest and never read because the script hurt his eyes. The widow held the Spanish page in both hands, a parchment crease running straight as a ditch down its center. The revelation drew a line across the sky the way lightning writes. The rancher understood what came next. Paper had to become action, or else it was just words like the ones he had swallowed instead of spoken the day the water took that child. He saddled, slung his rifle, not for threats but for coyotes, and tied his tin of assay weights behind the cantle because the county man would demand measures. He rode with the widow and the blacksmith and the midwife and 2 troopers into the arroyo where the willow made shade and the cool sang thin and sweet. He found the old stone set by men who did not hurry, half buried in silt, with a line carved fine as a hair and a cross at the corner. He wiped it clean and spat dust into the wind and placed the Spanish page against it and felt something shift inside him, a piece that had been jammed since the day he had stepped back instead of in. He dragged chain and took bearing with the surveyor's glass under the guidance of a trooper who'd done the work along the Rio Grande in service and knew what true north felt like when sweat made a man doubt his compass. The blacksmith lifted the stone with a grunt that made his apron string cry out, and they set it where the original notation demanded, not where the flood had argued. The telegraph key clicked again back at the water stop, passing their act along the wire until the next town knew, and then the next, like a rumor that made pride unnecessary. That night the ranch yard changed. Lanterns hung from fence posts, not for celebration yet, but for safety, signaling that this place did not intend to hide. Long tables appeared, scavenged from the church and the schoolhouse and the bunkhouse, where cowhands swapped lies in a dozen accents after the long day. Food arrived the way courage does, anonymously and without fuss. Roasted pork that snapped under knife, apples baked to collapse, coffee that didn't scrape the tongue, bread split by hands that had blistered under washboards. Fiddle strings sang notes that admitted they were old. The widow moved among them, apron dusted with flour like moonlight. The rancher felt his shoulder hum, but did not sling it. When the last dish clinked into the tub and the children ran toward the corral to plait manes with twine, the rancher sat on the plank bench and folded his hands as if approaching a grave he had finally learned to honor with silence. No proposal crossed his tongue. The promise had already been made in the barn, in the arroyo, in the ledger. He felt something soft as a ribbon drop across his knuckles. He did not look down because he knew whose hand it was. For a breath, the territory held still, as if the desert itself respected a moment not bought or bargained or wrestled. Then consequence came, because that is how the frontier disciplines the hopeful. The association did not retreat, it pivoted. The telegraph out of the water stop produced a final burst before the line went dark, and the key truncated the last word so that it arrived like a cut rope. Traitor inside camp. Boots thundered on the porch as a rider flung himself out of the blue dusk, eyes rimmed with dust, horse foam stringed, saddle slick with fear. He pointed with his chin because his hands shook too hard. The ridge above the town wore silhouettes like bristles. The foreman sat saddle straight while men beside him uncoiled something that glinted and cast bottles down the slope like seeds. The town's only well sat in the square where the gallows had leaned that morning. The blacksmith's wife lifted the lid and smelled what no family can drink and live. The preacher closed his ledger, not of shame but calculation, and glanced toward the depot as if a train might arrive with salvation on a flat car. He did not understand that trains take orders from grade and water, not wishes. The rancher drew breath and felt it fill him clean. He understood the arithmetic now. Redemption takes coin whether a man brings it willingly or the day robs him in the street. He moved toward the well with a speed he had not found at the ford. He threw back the rope, unspooled buckets, and called on hands that had lifted stones in arroyos and children out of barns and coffins out of wagons. The widow ran with him, skirt hitched without worry for scandal, hair unpinned by necessity. The buffalo soldiers took positions as if the square were a fort and the ridge a hostile horizon. Chinese trackmen shouldered picks, because a pick can be a weapon when a man needs it and a tool when he does not. The boy with the scarf hauled a yoke twice his weight and did not complain, because the body will sometimes do what the soul asks when the soul finally learns to ask. One crystalline line rose inside the rancher and refused to be anything but plain. A man is the trail of his choices when the water runs out. One practical thing rose beside it. Verify before accusing and share the water even when it has been poisoned. He looked at the preacher and at the deputy and at the foreman on the ridge with his leverage and his riders arranged like chessmen, and he felt no grandeur, only an accounting. He had posted a notice at noon. A single widow had answered. Between those two acts, a life had changed because he chose to pay rather than hoard. He would pay again. He would pay with whatever the day demanded. The town gathered around the well as the riders crested, the poison sloshing against stone like laughter. The telegraph lay dead. The train would not come until morning and would not care if it did. The sky threw stars like tacks on a floor. The lantern over the ledger page guttered and then steadied, light touching the blood thumbprint that started this turn of the wheel. Hoofbeats multiplied along the ridge in a sound like a fuse running. Somewhere a man with a vest under his duster lifted a hand that meant begin. Somewhere a wrist angled just so to strike a match. Somewhere a length of fuse brightened and then darkened and then brightened again. The town's only well was found poisoned as the association's riders crested the ridge, and the foreman's shadow stretched across the square long and straight as a